To deal with the insurgents in the Bush War, the Rhodesians employed Fireforce, a counterinsurgency tactic, a doctrine that is really based in encirclement, in something that has been fundamental to warfare throughout all of history. If I were to describe Fireforce with just two words, I would say rapid encirclement. Because all Fireforce is taking men, putting them on helicopters or planes, whatever, and then deploying them as fast as you can around the enemy. Because with insurgents, they are not operating in a way where they will have any sort of hope for reinforcement, where they will have any sort of line that you have to break through. With insurgents, you're talking about small cells, especially in the Rhodesian Bush War, that are operating in a specific region and are trying their best to stay away from the authorities, from the military, from the counterinsurgents. They don't want to actually be caught in an engagement, which makes them less of a fighting force and more of an armed agitator. But this makes them very easy to encircle, as you don't have to worry about deploying troops and breaking through and, cutting off the enemy. The moment the Rhodesians show up on the field, they are cutting off and encircling the enemy. And something that's brilliant about the strategy, and really shows you that military thinking, when it comes to tactics, when it comes to strategy, is rather simple, but it's not always immediately obvious. For example, it might seem like the best thing you can do is to just encircle the enemy and just sit and wait, or just encircle them and keep the pressure on them so that you can totally destroy them. Sometimes that's true. Most of the time it isn't. And this is something that the Mongols employed. The Mongols realized that if they encircled an army fully, and I'm sure people before the Mongols figured this out, but I have a historical example. The Mongols understood that if they encircled the enemy fully, the enemy would fight to the death. They would get into a last stand mentality, and they would fight very, very hard to the death. Here's how the Mongols avoided that. When they destroyed the Hungarian army, they almost encircled the Hungarian army. They were covering that army's escape from every side, but an opportunity for those Hungarians to flee into the swamp. They denied them every path of escape except the worst path of escape. So the Hungarians fled into the swamp, and they were easily hunted down once the battle was basically over and they were en route. That's how the Mongols destroyed the Hungarian army without forcing a bitter fight to the end. The Rhodesians do this too with Fireforce, because when they encircle the enemy, instead of just deploying all their men around the enemy, they do that, but they establish one set of those men as a stop group and another set of that men as sweeps. And the sweeping lines move forward into the enemy, towards the enemy's position, knowing that the enemy is not going to stand and fight. The enemy is going to begin retreating immediately, especially because these guerrillas do not really want a military confrontation. And who are they going to run right into? The stop groups. The stop groups are going to be all set up, all cozy, all comfortable, ready to kill the enemy and prevent their escape. That is how the Rhodesians kept themselves together during the Bush War. They did not have the numbers, they did not have the manpower of the insurgents, but they had air power, they had better strategy, better tactics, they had disciplined troops, and that is why they did as well as they did. And you might say that the Rhodesians lost the Bush War, but the loss that they had was not one of military defeat. It was one of politicking. It was a question of the international community. It was a question of sanctions. It was a question of posturing. It was a question of espionage. It was a question of a lot of things. But one thing it wasn't was military victory, because the Rhodesians in the Bush War had that very much under control. The only issue is that you can never fully control an insurgency. An insurgency will always, always, always agitate. They will always manage to kill people. They will always manage to destroy things, because a counterinsurgency can only really be a reaction. It can only be a reaction and a containment to a problem that can never be fully solved. The only way to fully solve it is to go to the source. It is to stomp it out where it is growing. And the Rhodesians did attempt this with their attack at Comoyo, Operation Dingo, as I know most of you know about that. Most people should. The Wikipedia summary gets posted everywhere because only 2 Rhodesians died and 3,000 of the enemy were killed. It wasn't really even a battle, it was a massacre. But it was very difficult for the Rhodesians to do that. They had to go through a lot of hoops and they had to go through a lot of loops, okay? They had to jump through all of this bureaucracy and all of this politicking. And when you start reading Rhodesian military memoirs, you're going to understand that there were a lot of operations and there were a lot of plans and there were a lot of things that the Rhodesians could have done to really get rid of their enemies and help them fully win the war almost. But they were stopped, and they were always stopped by the real enemy in the Rhodesian Bush War, the real serious enemy, which was the international community. It was the United States, the United Kingdom. It was MI6, for example. That's why I said espionage. British intelligence is the reason that Mugabe died very recently, and he didn't die back during the Bush War, because every assassination attempt on Mugabe and Nkomo and all of those other, liberation leaders were prevented by the MI6, the British intelligence, leaking information that they received by having infiltrated the Rhodesian High Command.